Being able to tell a story is a communication advantage. It is a competitive advantage. It is very, very important to tell your story if you want to grow a business, if you want to run for office, if you want your kids to listen to you, if you want to be entertaining. And it's just so easy to do it. It's not hard at all. So, 3 tips, here we go. If you've ever felt like people tune you out when you talk about your business, you're not imagining it, they are actually tuning you out. In fact, the average human brain daydreams about 30% of the time, and that number goes way up when somebody is listing facts or features or credentials, when it's not in a narrative structure. It drops dramatically, though, when the brain senses a story, especially a story that starts with a problem that they recognize as a problem that they actually have. So that is key. Tell stories and people will listen. Talk about bullet points and features and all that kind of stuff and facts, people will not pay attention. Here's how to tell the story. The first thing that you want to do is start with the problem. If you are giving a speech, walk to the middle of the stage and just say, we're all here today because we have a problem. Or, my guess is you are like me in the sense that you have a problem. I used to have that problem too. Or say, let me tell you about a customer of mine. They had this serious problem. You want to start with something negative. Not a statistic, not your background, not what you do, not even what your name is. Often when I give a speech, I tell them who I am 5 minutes into the speech. Why? Because, hey, I'm Donald Miller, CEO of StoryBrand, is not the best way to start. The best way to start is, hey, everybody, if you're trying to grow a business and people are ignoring you, it can cost you your entire business. You could go bankrupt. You have got to get attention. But how do you get attention when attention is scarce these days? I want to talk about that. My name is Donald Miller, and you see what I'm saying? I start with the problem, not what I do, not my background, not my title, none of that. I start with the problem. The problem is the hook. You want to start with the problem. Just try this tonight. At dinner, if somebody says, how was your day? Just sit there for a second and go, okay, what's the worst thing that happened to me today? And start with that and watch everybody lean in. Everybody will lean in. I swear to you, the problem is the hook. All right. When you open with the same problem that your customer is experiencing and you make it personal and painful, their brain has no choice but to pay attention. Now, I don't recommend having the same problem as your customer. I recommend having had the same problem as your customer. That problem needs to be past tense. You need to say, I used to not be able to clarify my message, but I learned to because I created the StoryBrand framework. People used to ignore me, but now they pay attention and join waitlists because I created the StoryBrand framework. The customer has to have the problem that you're talking about in order for them to pay attention, but you got to be careful because you have to not have that problem any longer. Otherwise, you lose authority and credibility to solve that problem. However, as soon as you say, you know, I used to deal with X, and your audience deals with that, suddenly the story feels like it's about them. And that's what I mean when I say make them the hero and yourself the guide. Most business owners actually do the opposite. They start with random facts or long explanations of what they do, and the audience checks out because there's no reason to lean in. Why does an audience pay attention to somebody telling a story? They pay attention to somebody telling a story because you've opened a story loop. A story loop is man meets a woman in a coffee shop, falls in love with her immediately, she runs away, he doesn't have her name, he doesn't have her phone number. Story loop. How in the world are they going to get together, right? You've opened a story loop that asks a question, how can we get those two together? They belong together. That's how stories work. So when you actually walk up on stage and you say, I bet you 90% of this audience is dealing with this problem, and I bet it hurts. You are sucking that audience in because they're saying, how are you going to help me solve my problem, right? They sense that you have opened a story loop, and now you're obligated to close the loop with some sort of product or philosophy or 3 points that will solve the problem. That's why in story structure, in screenwriting, the climactic scene is often called the obligatory scene. If I put a rom-com together and this man falls in love with this woman at a coffee shop, and turns out she's engaged to his con artist brother, the obligatory scene is that that man and that young woman get together at the end. That there's a marriage, a wedding at the end, and they get together because the obligatory scene that I've created is I am obligated to make sure she doesn't marry the con artist, but marries the good brother. And now I've got a movie, and you're going to spend the next 90 minutes laughing and crying watching the action unfold. You got to open that story loop at the beginning. That is why you start with the problem. The audience is going to check out if you don't do it. All right, when you start with the problem, the customer recognizes there's a reason to pay attention, and you earn their attention instantly. The story has begun, but it only begins when you say the problem. Until then, people are waiting for you to start the story. That's why I say start it the first second you walk up. If you start talking about who you are, they're like, where's this going? Your title, where's this going? The company that you own, why does this matter? Okay, I'm glad you wrote a book. I don't care. You've got I think about 6 to 8 seconds to get to the problem before their minds are designed to tune you out. And you do not want them tuning you out. Start with the problem. Once you've introduced the problem, here's what great storytellers do next. They make it worse. And this is where a lot of business owners get really uncomfortable. You gotta make it absolutely worse. Talk about the physical problem that you solve, and then talk about the emotional ramifications of that physical problem next. You might say something like, does your dog bark every time somebody knocks at the door? Oh my gosh, it's so annoying, isn't it? It makes your blood boil, and then you feel like you're such a rude person because you can't even let the person in the door. Here they are visiting your house. Now you look like you're inhospitable, and this person is feeling awkward, and so they're associating that awkwardness with you because your dog is barking and you can't control the dog. They feel accused by this dog like there's some sort of burglar, and they're associating that with you. It's awful. My name is Donald Miller, and I train dogs not to bark at the door. You see what I'm saying? And then I go into the 3 ways you can get a dog to not bark at the door, which, by the way, I have no idea what those 3 things are, but if you learn, tell me, because my dog barks at the door. Right? You make it worse, and that sets the hook. The problem presents the hook. Making it worse sets the hook. This is a fly fishing term. What happens when you get a nibble on a fly rod, you feel that, you set the hook, you jerk the hook, and you catch the fish. The fish is attracted to the problem, and then when they bite the problem, you make it worse, and now they're hooked on you as a speaker or as a storyteller. You can make the problem worse in a couple ways. One, make it physically worse, but it's worse than that. The dog will actually bite people or whatever. Or you talk about the emotional thing that happens. Regardless, you keep the conflict up. You elevate the conflict even higher, and it's going to make people want to listen to you even more. In movies, the hero doesn't just face a problem. The problem has to escalate, right? Again, the guy doesn't get her number, but then he finds out it's even worse. The jerk brother is there dating this girl, and she's engaged to him. It just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until the end of the movie. In fact, I teach a writing class sometimes at my house, and I've got like 1,000 books on a bookshelf. I will often tell somebody in my writing class, go over there and pick a book off the shelf. They pick a book off the shelf. Any book, doesn't matter. Open it to any page. Any page, doesn't matter. Put your finger down on one paragraph. Any paragraph, it doesn't matter. And they do that, and then I say, let me tell you what that paragraph is about. It's about conflict. Somebody is having a really hard time. Somebody's up a creek. Somebody is in trouble. I have never been wrong, even though I should be wrong 20% of the time. The reason is 80% of the pages in every single one of those books is about conflict. Why? Because that book got published, and that's a good book. And good authors who publish books and write good stories know it's all about conflict. So ramp up that conflict. All right, here's the 3rd tip, and this is where StoryBrand really comes in. Your job is not to be the hero of the story. Your job is to be the guide who helps the hero win. This is where you introduce your product or your service as the thing that helps the customer out of the hole. If you're giving a presentation that has 3 points, position your 3 points as the formula or the playbook or the solution or the steps that you take to solve that awful emotional problem. You tell the story about how it works. You want to position your product as the thing, as the guide. You're the guide, and your product is the tool that they are going to use to save the day and win. This is important. It is absolutely okay to talk about yourself here. People say, well, if the customer's the hero and I'm the guide, I can't talk about myself. Not true. You can talk about why you care, how you used to have the problem, a customer that you met that used to have the problem, how you got smart and competent and equipped at solving that problem, and how that became your mission. Notice I'm talking about myself all the time, but what I'm talking about is why I care so deeply about you. So you need to talk about how you became competent and passionate about helping people solve that problem. It's part of your story. If you want to see, by the way, this exact structure in action, I made a video called The Story Behind StoryBrand. Look it up on YouTube. In that video, I walk through the problem that I solve. I make the problem worse. I explain why I cared enough about it to solve it, and I show the transformation on the other side. It's just an example of how to tell your story. Do I do it amazingly well? I give myself a B+. I've seen A+. 95% of people get an F. Now, how do we end it? Every great story ends with a clear picture of life after the problem is solved. This is the future that your customer wants. And now they can see it for themselves because you are talking about what life looks like. Now, my client, Jane, when somebody knocks at the door, the dog doesn't even get up. He just lays there and he looks to see who it is, or he comes over and he wags his tail shyly. But Jane has never been embarrassed since I trained that dog. And by the way, I do it with some treats. There's no punishment or anything. Let me come train your dog. You're painting the picture of the obligatory scene. The man and the woman get married and the con artist brother goes to jail. However that story needs to end, you're ending the story. Great storytelling does not come from talent. It comes from practice. I want you to use this formula for telling your company's story, for telling any story, and tell it again and again and again until people lean in every time that you open your mouth. Great storytelling takes practice. Now listen, if you want help practicing this every single week, I do send out a short video at weeklysoundbite.com where I take a soundbite strategy that some leader, some brand, some marketing agency, or I used with a client to invite customers into a story. I send you an example of that. It's not on YouTube. It's not anywhere else on the internet. You have to go to weeklysoundbite.com. I send this video out to tens of thousands of folks, and I want you to be one of them. The bottom line is this. You need to learn to tell your story in a way that is interesting. And if you use the formula that I gave you, it's going to work for you. All right? Here's to you telling your story. Here's to deeply connecting with people. Here's to you rehearsing that story until it works better and better. And here's to you using storytelling and the powerful tool of storytelling to grow your business. All right, see you in the next YouTube video.